Hey Valerie, how are you?
Hey Jeremy, I'm good. How are you?
Good. It's been a big week and month for news. Obviously, Trump has won, and all of us were waiting for that to happen. Obviously, the US has a lot of impact with Vietnam as a market. And I was really looking forward to hearing your point of view, Valerie, about this.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest topic that everyone discussing globally for this month. And I think for Vietnamese community, a lot of us are more leaning toward to conservative Republican. So actually a lot of Vietnamese community actually like celebrating Trump's wins. This include like Vietnamese retail investor in Vietnam and Vietnamese overseas community who like live in the US. So yeah, actually our culture is very like traditional, conservative, family oriented. So you'll be surprised that most Vietnamese community actually is more pro Trump in this election. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really surprising to hear because in America, I think there's a lot of Asian Americans and they're considered to be more pro Democrat, I would say, rather than necessarily pro Kamala. I think there's a little bit of a dissonance between, I guess, when you open up the Washington Post, which is versus, I think, what you're describing about Vietnamese people in Vietnam.
So if you look at Vietnamese American community, most of them live in really red states, such as Texas,
Mm,
Oklahoma. If they live in California, they tend to live in Orange County, which
mm,
is traditionally more Republican. For the Vietnamese, like local Vietnamese, some of us have some concern about Trump being more hawkish into international trade by talking about putting more tariff. However, in generally, local retail investor here in Vietnam are more pro-Trump because he's more hawkish into China rather than all actually to Vietnam. So
mm,
net, I think it's still more a win for Trump. Is still more celebrated in Vietnam, especially among the business communities. Because
mm.
there's we talk about this all in the past. There's a lot of like friendshoring opportunity, Chinese moving manufacturing to Vietnam and create like more jobs here.
I think what's interesting is I think that bifurcation, right, between Vietnamese Americans versus
Yeah.
local Vietnamese, right? And I think what's interesting, like you said, is that for Vietnamese Americans, they're similar to Cuban Americans. They left Vietnam during the Vietnam War, so they are not a fan of communism because they were
Yeah.
on the Democratic side, and so for them, they've obviously tended to lean more Republican, which is more anti-communist, more national security from their perspective. So I think there's a understandable dynamic there. It's just that I think it's again interesting that local Vietnamese, an American might be like, don't you love communism? As a Vietnamese person, as a local, wouldn't you prefer Kamala, who seems to be more stable for global trade, not going to have tariffs, going to be a little bit more normal? She's also half Asian from the American
Yeah.
perspective. So I think there's that cognitive dissonance, which is, I think, people don't expect local Vietnamese to be pro Trump. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess so. But if you look at Biden administration, actually we were there. The Biden administration actually called Vietnam as a currency manipulator. And also, like we discussed in a few episodes back ago, we did not recognize us as a market economy status. So it's actually not that friendly to Vietnam. And I don't think even come president that would change. So Trump is, with that being said, I don't think Trump is very predictable because in 2017, during his first term, he was really friendly and open, loved Vietnam, and did not really attack like the trade between Vietnam and the US at that point. I guess because the trade surplus of Vietnam and US back in 2017 was just about like 40 billion. But in 2019, he really changed attitude and suddenly attacking. Oh, Vietnam government is taking advantage of the U.S. We give them way too much trade surplus, and now it got ballooned up to about 100 million or more. I think it regardless of Democrat or Republican, we cannot really avoid the incident that they might not be friendly to the bilateral trade, and we have to be diplomatic for to whoever would win the election. But with Trump, I think it's so clear that he's not gonna let the trade surplus between China and US further balloon. So immediately there's already a lot of Chinese manufacturing and Chinese business owners moving down to Vietnam. So that's why we favor Trump a bit more, because his attitude is more like aggressive, also going after the big brother who we always a bit anti-China. I don't say anti-China. We don't want to let the big brother bully us, and like Trump win, making sure that we won't be like bullied by the Chinese government.
Yeah. So basically, what we're saying here is that the Vietnamese-Chinese relationship is really the most important. There's a power imbalance, at least perceived. There's a hierarchy of big brother, small brother. And so with America more confrontational with China, it gives Vietnam a little bit more breathing room, more negotiating leverage. So yeah, it will be interesting to see how that plays out. I think you mentioned something interesting, which is that I think Vietnamese factories have already been moving to Vietnam. We talked about this in the past. They set up warehouses, they set up live streaming centers across the border. And it sounds like there's going to be more Chinese factories moving to Vietnam, because at least if they assemble the final stages of the product will be labeled made in Vietnam instead of made in China, right? So some of that trade surplus as well could be Chinese capital funding Vietnamese assembled and manufactured goods. What are your thoughts about this?
I think for sure, because right now, what Trump has been saying in his campaign is he's going to have about 60% tariff to Chinese goods and only between 10 to 20% tariff on all the country, like all the foreign country goods. So it's no brainer that if the Chinese manufacturing want to still be in business, they have to moving either to Vietnam, Southeast Asia, or to India. And definitely they don't want to have the made in China label. So it's a clear win for Vietnam here. And yeah, I think I've been just hearing more and more, especially consumer electronic factories are moving down to Vietnam. A few years ago, it was more like furniture, more like commodities, fast, easy as to assemble. Vietnam even was being accused of transshipment hub, because a lot of commodity can just be like shipped to Vietnam and be shipped to US from Vietnam port. But recently, especially this year, I've been hearing a lot of story about how consumer electronics factories are moving down to Vietnam and actually having like factory assembling line here. They hire workers here to prevent the risk of being accused as having just a transshipment hub from Vietnam.
And I think what's interesting is that how does that relationship work? How does a country have its factory move from China to Vietnam? What moves from your perspective? The capital, the supervisors, the technical talent, the local folks? What have you seen from Chinese factories moving to Vietnam?
Yeah, so for sure they have to send one or two general manager who like 100% like Chinese local down to Vietnam, and from those general manager will assemble the local team of from labor, like from factory workers to their like assistant to the marketing products from Vietnam. So that's what I'm seeing so far. I'm not sure how much of the technology gets shifted from China to Vietnam. I hear some complaint that the laborers, the talents here, not as well high skill and not as productive as the labor in Chinese factories. So they still have to take some time to train these workers in Vietnam. But yeah, for sure they have the general manager have to come in from China.
Yeah. And you previously mentioned that a lot of the Chinese factories are moving to North Vietnam, right, rather than South Vietnam because of the infrastructure and the parks. Could you share more about the infrastructure and the locations where these Chinese factories are moving towards?
I think both north and south. Yeah, both north and south. Most recently, the consumer electronic one that I heard actually moved to one of the industrial park in the south. So both regions are being benefited from this move.
I think that means, if I was to make a guess, that means maybe power consumption is going to go up for manufacturing in Vietnam. Maybe air pollution will get worse because you're going to burn more coal. I mean, I'm just guessing here, but how does that sound?
We all hope that the domestic consumption will grow, because That will benefit to a lot of startups here and also the VC here too. This year, that has shown in a lot of company performance because it's still a pretty tough year for Vietnam, coming from the typhoon, hurricane, and also the lingering effect of the real estate crisis. So it hasn't reflected in the 2024 pictures, but I think the domestic consumption will be further strengthened in 2025 and 2026 because now that politics is a lot more stable, we know who's in power for Vietnam, who's in power for US. I'm optimistic that things will be stabilized and consumption will strengthen a lot more in 2025.
What other impacts do you think would happen because of this transition or new administration?
Yeah, like I mentioned, Trump is really not easy to predict. He changed attitude toward Vietnam twice in his first term. And I don't expect he will be like very nice, very smooth to Vietnam. So that 100 billion trade surplus, he will want to narrow it down. We will be scrutinized by him because right now we are in top four of. If you look at the country with highest trade surplus with the US, we are actually in top four. So I'm sure Trump will scrutinize it and will ask us to import more from US. And I think that will include defense, aircraft technology, gas, to further balance out the trade surplus. He might even be more hawkish on like the currency manipulator accusation. That's on the kind of immediate effect side. But I think in the long term, he really. So if you look, if last year the Trump organization actually announced a joint venture with a real estate conglomerate in Vietnam. So together they will build a new golf course in northern Vietnam. So he has some like personal business interests in Vietnam, in the country. So will he aggressively attack Vietnam for the entire 4 years of his term? I don't think so. But when he first got, my prediction is when he first got into power, like next year, he will be quite hawkish because he wants to prove that his campaign, like he's delivering his promise during the campaign by narrowing down the trade surplus of US. Yeah.
Yeah. When you think about trade surplus, trade deficit, do you think Vietnam is going to buy more aircraft, weapons, gas? Do you think that's something that Vietnam is able to do well and buy?
Oh yeah, it's such a tough question because we also have to buy things from China as well. So our largest, so we import most of our stuff from China and export most of our stuff to US. So how to balance this like import export between China and US? I think we will have to diversify our defense and supply chain, meaning we will have to buy some more aircraft and defense from the US instead of mainly relying on China and Russia. Yeah, because realistically, I think President Trump will ask us to narrow that trade surplus gap. He's not gonna be nice and let that 100 billion trade surplus gap to be the same. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that now I guess you have two big brothers. You've always had them, but now you have two big brothers that are a little bit more confrontational with each other. How do you think the new Vietnamese kind of like administration, how they're going to sort it out or navigate it using their bamboo strategy?
I think they still will implement the same bamboo strategy. But if you look at the Mr. Tolam, immediately the moment when Trump was announced to win, he immediately called him and then invite him to fly to Vietnam. So it's a very hard question. I hope he will manage well the same bamboo strategy and balance China and US. But you can clearly see like the first call that Mr. Tolam did. And actually before the election, he flew to US and visited Biden. It's not easy to balance both big powers, but definitely we are highly respect and don't want to miss out on further economic opportunity by trading with the US because right now they are the largest export of Vietnamese goods.
What other impacts does the Trump administration have from your perspective on Vietnam?
Yeah, I think despite all of the hawkish attitude that he has toward Vietnam in the past, and also Biden administration as well. I still think this is a golden opportunity for Vietnam to step up among the international recognition. Because previously we were not known for a manufacturing country, because our manufacturing share to the world is only about like 2 to 3%. But with Trump win and with a lot of moving manufacturing shifting from China to Vietnam, I'm hoping we are stepping up our position and gaining our share in the manufacturing economy globally. So net, I still think this is a more positive news for Vietnam. Yeah. And like I said, the Trump corporation has a personal interest, personal business interest to Vietnam. He just signed last month. Yeah, he signed a new JV of the golf course in northern Vietnam. So it has to bring with something like some thesis from Trump about Vietnam. I don't think the Trump organization will randomly pointing out like, hey, they will build a new golf course in a random country. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure there'll be a lot of Vietnamese and Chinese delegations playing golf at the new golf course.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
I think it's interesting because it's a bit of a contrast, right? We've been looking at Singapore, we've been looking at Indonesia, and I think there are different feelings about it. Obviously, like Indonesia, they might see more protectionism that's inspired by Trump. I think Vietnam is not going to go down that route. Singapore is not. Singapore is quite pegged to free trade between Singapore, China, and America. So obviously, I think a more decoupling world is actually more trickier for Singapore to navigate. So it's interesting to see that different countries within Southeast Asia have differing points of view and different impact of the Trump administration. I think thinking through about second order, third order effects, I think it'll be interesting to see also whether there's going to be more Chinese exports to the Vietnamese economies. Would local SMEs in Vietnam struggle more against Chinese imports? Because that's something that the Indonesian market has been facing as a challenge from their perspective, is they feel like their local SMEs are not able to compete with Chinese imports anymore. That would be interesting to hear.
Yeah, if I'm being honest, this year has been quite tough for local SMEs. As I mentioned, consumption is really slow, really dampened this year, mostly from the lingering effect of the real estate crisis. So if you drive around like the street that only sell clothing in Ho Chi Minh City, a few years ago it was full of shops, and this year a lot of them just closed down, and the shops are still open for rent. Yeah, so can local SMEs compete with the Chinese SMEs? I think it will be tough. Even if you look at local e-commerce, like local startups, a lot of them are struggling to compete against Shopee, TikTok. Now Temu just entered Vietnam as well. So we don't have the over protectionism that Indonesia did, but that also directly, indirectly kill a lot of local SMEs in Vietnam too,
Yeah,
especially
let's
in
talk
like
about
fashion industry. Yeah.
let's talk about Temu, right? Indonesia just flat out banned Temu, and then this doesn't allow the Temu app to be listed in the Indonesian app stores for Android as well as the iPhone. So talk about Temu entering Vietnam. How has the experience been like? What are people buying from your experience for Temu?
So I haven't used Temu yet. They just set up a team. I think a few friends of mine tried using Temu, but the payment flow wasn't really smooth. So they got refunded. Actually, they didn't get the good deliver. Maybe I tried this today. Yeah. So yeah,
You can give us a Temu review, yeah.
yeah, some of my friends tried, but the goods got refunded.
What do you think about Temu's impact on the other e-commerce platforms, right? So you have local platforms. Obviously, you already have TikTok Shop already. Do you think they're going to take up large share, or do you think there's not much share to take?
I think in this e-commerce game, you can always, it all depends on like how much you're willing to spend, and you can always win. The market share is there, but you can always win it back. It's just like ride hailing. The more discounts you get, you give, the higher market share you will get. So right now, the biggest market share are divided among like Shopee, TikTok Shop. I think Lazada is the third one, but by really far. So the top twos are dominated by Shopee and TikTok Shop already. So if Temu is willing to spend a tons, easily they can be in top three. I don't even mention local platform anymore. Yeah.
Oh, you think they're gone? They did?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think what's interesting is that these local e-commerce platforms, they were obviously inspired by American e-commerce platforms and obviously Chinese e-commerce platforms. So they grew quite aggressively. And then now they're being outcompeted by these Chinese platforms. I think Indonesia, they're starting to get acquired by the Chinese e-commerce platforms, or they're getting shielded using protectionist bans or taxation. Do you think that has a dampening effect on Vietnamese startups, because like they're going to grow up, but then there's so much Chinese talent, Chinese startups that can compete with them? Is it going to be difficult for Vietnamese startups to grow up on its own 2 feet and go public on their own path?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think definitely local startups, if they only focus on local markets and one day their funding get cut off, it's hard to win in this competitive market because we don't have the same protectionism that Indonesia government did. So we just let our local e-commerce slowly losing market share and slowly die. So more and more, I think startups in Vietnam have to look at cross-border opportunities, uh, selling to Vietnam, but also outside Vietnam and making it cheaper from Vietnam. So this is where I see a lot of advantages of founders building from Vietnam as well, because it's much cheaper, more affordable to hire engineers in Vietnam, and if they can sell it to global market, US, Europe, by using Amazon, if they are selling goods and services, or software, if they can have a stellar sell team and compete directly with Indians and American SaaS, that's where the advantage come in. But I think if they only stellar focus on Vietnam domestic market, I think the pie is just getting smaller and smaller. Competition from international players is also getting more fierce as well, and we don't really enjoy the. I'm not sure if it's enjoy, but we don't have the same protectionism policy that Indonesia government had.
When you think about this, do you think Vietnam should have more protectionism, or do you think the current policy works? I'm just curious what you think.
Yeah, so I don't agree with protectionism. I think as a consumer, I want to be able to use the best product. If Shopee has the best like logistic delivery platform, if TikTok has the best entertainment source of entertainment, if Facebook has the best like algorithm, I want to be able to use them. So I don't really agree with the protectionism, but I think it's a lesson for the startup founders and also startup like investors in Vietnam that we have to tell our founders to like think bigger and chase more cross-border opportunities rather than just competing in such a small market like Vietnam.
When you look at the next year ahead, 2025, any predictions you have for what 2025 will look like?
Yeah, so my prediction is we'll go overseas more, especially the founders in Vietnam. And there would be a lot more founders moving back to Vietnam. And I'm seeing more and more of those profiles who already have a lot of experience in the US. And they come back to Vietnam and assemble a cheaper engineering team, cheaper labor team here in Vietnam, but selling to the world. So the push and the need to go global it's gonna be stronger in 25 and 2026 because we realize we can no longer rely on just one market.
When you say that Vietnamese companies are going to go more cross-border, does that mean, for example, like Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, for example, or would it mean more like China or America? Or what does it mean for you think to say cross-border? Which direction does cross-border mean?
Yeah, so it also depends on the background and experience of the founders. If the founders have working experience or like education in US or Europe, they would just target those country or those market immediately because they know they were educated there and they have their connection there. They can even build sales teams in the US, for example. But for most of the founders who born and raised and based in Vietnam their entire life, their immediate target is more like Southeast Asian country like Thailand, Philippines, and maybe Indonesia.
Here you are obviously going through that. Are you excited for 2025? Are you fearful? How do you think about it?
Yeah, it's definitely a shift and a change in the outlook into Vietnam. But I'm more excited and especially looking for the founders who have these ambitions to go like global cross-border, or even the founders who are Vietnamese but already like selling or living in overseas markets. And yeah, I forgot to mention that a lot of founders who born and raised and based in Vietnam their entire life actually starting to like importing into a market like Korea, Japan. Some of them even tried China. Haven't even though we haven't seen like a big startup success story, but there's like a lot of successful brands, Vietnamese brands, who made it big in China, such as Trung Nguyên Coffee. Yeah, so there is somebody else who did that. There's not many startups that prove that yet, but I think this is our time to actually make that cross-border global story become true. Yeah.
On that note, thank you so much for sharing, Valerie, and see you next month.